Well, howdy, folks. We're here to talk about cloud cost optimization and managing public cloud consumption costs. I'm Peter Kraatz, the Portfolio Director for Insight's Cloud and Data Center Transformation Consulting Group. And with me are two of our practice leads from the cloud group within consulting. Scott Cameron, there, at least he's in the middle on my screen anyway. Scott heads up our Azure consulting business, and John O'Shaughnessy on the right for me is responsible for our AWS consulting business. So first off, is cloud cost optimization a topic with our clients, in particular with IT leadership? Is cost optimization a thing, I guess, is what I'd ask.
It is absolutely, for some, but not everybody.
Yeah, it's a conversation that we have a lot with customers. It comes in at various different parts of their cloud journey, sometimes at the beginning, sometimes more toward the middle.
You know, I've seen some studies. I've had some anecdotal conversations about cloud costs, and within that context, I hear rumors of, or at least the general vibe that clients are pulling out of public cloud because cost is this big thing. Is that are you observing that in your conversations with IT leaders? Is that actually happening as well?
It's sort of anecdotal. I mean, we see people worrying about it. We see the reports of it. But when you dig deeper, I think the people who have moved are being a bit more thoughtful about what they're going to do. But I think they're starting to realize it's not a one-size-fits-all.
Yeah, I think we're all trying to understand exactly what's happening. We even commissioned a survey to kind of get a little bit deeper on what's behind some of the pullback. And really, it's not about a wholesale pullback. It's really more about a re-envisioning and reassessment of what is a good fit for moving to the cloud and what is not or should not be moved to the cloud.
Yeah, I think I've seen some of that same data. It's really a bit of a mixed bag, centered mostly on making sure the right consumption is happening instead of some runaway build train, as it were. So our IT leaders are talking about cost optimization, and there's certainly a lot of scary press or sales talking points about how public cloud's going to rob you blind. But is it really that scary? I mean, really, what's the worst case scenario if you don't focus some energy on managing costs and optimizing your consumption patterns? What's the worst that can happen?
Well, the worst that can happen is you're going to run out of money. One of my favorite anecdotes from a real client is that they had planned to operate in the cloud. They moved everything over. They're very proud of themselves. And after 4 months, they came to us and said, "Hey, can you help us move back on premises? Because we've burned through our annual budget in 4 months."
Yeah, that's pretty common for customers to come to us and tell us, we have unexpected spend and we don't even know why. We don't know who's using the services even. And the basic design and governance and controls that all the platforms provides ample opportunity to limit consumption and track and manage consumption if you set them up. And that's really the challenge they're working through, is they did not do that on the front end, and now they're having to go back and retrofit controls to make sure that they don't get spending that's out of line with expectations.
The consumption model is so different. And you take 20, 30 years of IT budgeting where somebody decides we need to do more things. Let's budget for some new hardware. Let's get that budget approved. Once it's approved, hardware's installed, you don't worry about it again until the end of the year. Whereas in the cloud model, you're paying every day based on what you use. And it's such a different model that a lot of IT leaders are having difficulty making that mind shift to that new world.
Yeah, there's nothing worse than finding out that you've got something running in cloud that you didn't even know existed, and that's consuming a huge amount of the price that you're paying to the platform. When perhaps you could have identified that before you even moved it and not moved it, and now you have to deal with it later.
It's really a culture change in how they got to look at this stuff.
Feels like there is an analogy, in the past when Scott, you and I were talking some time ago about we used to manage SharePoint sites and how this feels a lot like the age old problem of, let's just let anybody open up and create new SharePoint sites, and then all of a sudden, holy cow! At the end of the day, what happens?
The problem is the organic growth that you get. It's like dominoes. If you let the first one fall, the other ones are going to fall. And SharePoint was very much this way. You open it up and you say, this is a fantastic collaboration tool, and you let it loose, and then all of a sudden you've got undocumented hundreds of SharePoint sites that have no controls, governance, and you don't even have a way to track them. And then you have to deal with them on the back end. It's like, do we need all these? Can we get rid of some of them? If only we had set up some controls on the front end. Azure is very much the same way. You've got to set up those controls on the front end so that you control the usage of the platform, because you're paying for this not as a single upfront expense where you can consume unlimited amounts, but you're paying for every compute cycle you use and every bit of storage that you use.
When you think about how, when we were in mainline IT, which feels like a completely different lifetime ago, the on-premise version of this problem was kind of self-limiting, right? Wasn't it? I mean, when you're out of disk and you're out of memory and you're out of blades to assign, you're out. That's it.
Absolutely. Things were self-contained. Again, as Scott mentioned, the world is different now, but the tools are there. It's just getting people in the mindset, IT leaders and technologists alike, to be able to build in the processes to use these tools, watch the consumption, and then plan further ahead about, okay, here's a change we need to make because we're burning through more resources than we anticipated.
Yeah, cloud never shrinks. I mean, people say they're pulling back, but really, once it's out there, it pretty much stays out there. And that means that there are consequences for companies that have moved things that perhaps shouldn't be moved or weren't ready to be moved. And maybe there's a better choice as to where that application or workload should live.
Is there, I imagine you've had some of these conversations with IT leaders about, this recurring theme that's come up here at least a half a dozen times in the last just 5 minutes around governance. How do customers react to that conversation? I mean, do they understand what you're trying to tell them? Is it a foreign concept?
I think the process, they all nod their head as if they understand what we're talking about, but they often don't want to take that next step to invest the time required to pull apart their process, to see where a change control process that may exist needs to be modified to work in the cloud, or approval processes, et cetera. They get it at a high level. They certainly nod their head, but a lot of them don't want to invest the effort and time, perhaps because we're not doing a good enough job of showing them the value of doing that.
Yeah, the controls are all there, and making sure that you're enabled to understand how to use them really isn't that challenging a process, but it does delay slightly a move to the cloud to make sure that you're doing it the right way. The benefits pay off forever, however, as you move in a planned way that you can track and manage, and you understand the tools that are available.
I think about the resistance to that movement towards better governance tools, controls, the same way I think about the way we had resistance back in the ITIL heyday, 15 years ago or so. And we received a lot of complaints about unnecessary delays and overhead and process. And maybe the resistance comes from that history and some of that baggage that comes along with it, perhaps.
Yeah, we tend to be engaged with more of the technical, tactical side of the business because we're engineering solutions for them, right?
Okay.
Governance to that kind of organization sometimes is a real challenge. They may not have, a great background in IT service management or ITIL. They don't know how the addition of a cloud platform is going to affect their processes and departments like help desk and service desk. What is moving to the cloud and adding a new platform that is really different from your existing data center platform? How is that going to change control and asset management? Changes happen in seconds or minutes instead of weeks and months. So it's a big change for organizations, and that's one of the challenges that kind of hits them, from the side as they move to the cloud. They really don't expect to have to re-envision how they deliver IT.
All right, I feel bad because we've been talking now for the last 6, 7, 8, 10 minutes on, when it feels like we're just focusing on the downside and the scare quotes. So let me try and turn that around a little bit and get to a happier place. Where, in your opinion, is public cloud really the right cost solution, the right value? Where is it a no-brainer that you should be leveraging public cloud just because it's a better value all up?
I think a lot of that depends on the application. So a new application born in the cloud, taking advantage of serverless, taking advantage of platform as a service, that's where you're going to see your big wins. Direct movement to infrastructure as a service, just moving your VMs out there isn't necessarily where you're going to get the bang for the buck. So you can find that.
Yeah, there are certainly some compute patterns that are really good candidates for moving to the cloud. Things that are consistent, but only happen during certain periods of the month or quarter, batch processes. Applications and workloads that can scale based on performance over time. Think about any tax preparer or the IRS. They've got a huge increase in the amount of demand on their systems. Well, maybe not this year, but leading up to tax day and, right after. But then after that, they have all of these systems that they provisioned that go unused for 3/4 of the year. How cool is it to be able to automate the availability of that stuff based on when it's necessary to be running and then not pay for the compute for that when it's not in use?
Yeah, so some of what you're kind of angling at here is both the nature of the workload and also a little bit about some of the techniques as well. But where you can take a workload that has a regular compute pattern that doesn't consume, let's say, an entire CPU assignment, right? Constantly, it's easy to justify, but I feel like you need some governance over top of it to even make that work. Would that be a correct sort of assumption based on what you were saying?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
So we talked a little bit about it. In broad strokes, right? We've said when you can improve, I think you were alluding to it, John. When you can improve functionality born in the cloud. But then also you're managing the reporting side simultaneously. It feels like a march towards a certain level of efficiency and knowledge and control over your workloads that a lot of our IT leaders don't have today.
Yeah, that's correct. Again, it gets back to the culture of control, culture of monitoring. They're going to just have to build this in to understand their utilization, to keep their finger on the pulse on a daily basis, really. And that's what's going to allow them to be cost effective in the cloud.
How have big organizations that you folks have talked to their thought leaders, their IT leaders, how have they made it work? I mean, where have you seen them start out to be successful?
Well, what I've seen for them to be successful is they're not focusing on moving their oldest applications. They're looking at building new in the cloud, building native, taking advantage of the elasticity that's available so they can scale up and scale down, so they can use resources in the most efficient way possible. That's where they're being successful.
Yeah, I find the same thing. When they do the work on the front end, even if it's just some basic evaluation of what should we move when. They can even move while they're doing some of that evaluation. If there is a compelling event like a data center contract that is expiring, or the current crisis that is creating a compelling event for them to move to the cloud, at least during that effort, they can review the workloads that they're moving to the cloud to understand what the next level of maturity, of refactoring for those applications might be, so that they get more value out of the cloud platform. So there are some things they can do right now as they move that don't really delay their move to the cloud, that will help them a lot later.
All right, well, let's dive into some of those things that they can do. But before I jump, kind of head first into that deep water, Scott, you're focused on the Azure space. John, you're primarily focused on the Amazon space, which makes me regret a little bit that we didn't invite a fourth to the party to talk about our Google perspective. But are there fundamental differences in cost controls or methods and approaches between the providers that you would take? Would you approach it differently, I guess, depending on which CSP?
Not really. It's at a high level, the things you need to do, how you do the monitoring, what you're looking for are very much consistent across all the major cloud players.
Yeah, I mean, there are certainly differences in licensing. Microsoft owns Windows, and that makes a difference when you're running Windows on Microsoft platform, Azure. But, all of the players have apples to apples comparisons, but sometimes it's a bundle on one side and it takes multiple services on the other side to have that apples to apples discussion. So yeah, there's some complexity there, but for the most part, the capabilities and services around cost management and otherwise are very similar.
Yeah, I think I've seen some of that. You're alluding to this problem of the way they bundle their services being different makes it a little difficult to do an apples to apples comparison. A lot more difficult if you don't know what you're looking at in the first place. And I've heard some choice words from IT leaders about how some of it feels like a black hole. Does that create a pitfall of challenges? That opacity, does it create an opportunity to increase spend unnecessarily?
Yeah, if there's a different bundling of services between CSPs and you're moving, into the cloud for a specific functionality, there are potentially more moving parts. There's some more opportunities to get it wrong. And yes, there's some buy-in to the vendor's platform. Everybody's concerned with being too locked into a certain platform, or at least they have been in the past. But on the other hand, there's really some efficiencies to be gained by using those platforms in a more efficient way that drives more value through additional capabilities, through reducing costs and complexity.
So go ahead, John.
I was going to say, there are a lot of different levers to be pulled to monitor your costs, to control your costs when you're moving to the cloud. And as Scott alluded to, you can be very efficient, but you just have to look in different areas to figure that out.
So let's jump there. What's the first thing you folks look for when you're trying to guide IT leaders through cost optimization campaigns within their organization, or to reduce their public cloud spend? What's the first easy target you jump at?
Boy, the first thing I look at is the instances of compute that they're running, which is GPUs and data warehouses tend to be two of the largest consumers. And they both have, extremely high value for very specific workloads. But if you don't do the proper controls and governance on the front end, and you let people spin up whatever they want, they're going to spin up whatever they want. And it's going to end up coming back to bite you.
What about you, John?
I think that, storage in general, you've got the same problem we've seen for decades, which is storage that is orphaned, storage that's unused. And the ease of spinning things up in the cloud makes it more likely that that's going to be a bigger growth area. And then there's the little things that you don't think about, like load balancers, firewalls. How do the different providers charge for these things? And is it a cost that people think about? Because again, in the old world, it was, I'm going to buy a couple boxes. I bought the boxes. I don't have to worry about the cost of those anymore.
So interesting to hear you guys dive into this, because I've always thought that the received wisdom here on this is that no, it's always about the network egress charges. That's where everybody runs the bill up. But you're going in a completely different direction with this. So you've looked at some of those workloads, and you look at some of the services they're consuming to trim and manage more tightly. So in moving off the workload specifically and onto sort of the techniques for managing those workloads and costs, where do you start there? How do you think about that process of which knobs you're turning?
So if the idea is in the cloud, a benefit is you can pay by the hour, that means you need to look at how can I use things only by the hour as opposed to having them running all the time. So look at elasticity, look at the ability to spin up and spin down virtual machines, or look at the ability to stop using resources, say at the end of a development cycle when you're not needing them.
Yeah, there's a list that I go through with customers that ranges from licensing, the choice of VM sizes, like John said, automation of scale with elasticity, implementing governance with role-based access control, making sure that the foundation of cost management, so that's policies and tagging and other things, are in place so that you have the functionality of that cost management that you can leverage. Consolidating resources, subscriptions, tenants. Oftentimes when customers go to the cloud and they have that kind of organic growth that I talked about earlier, they end up with, through acquisition or through multiple teams or whatever, with multiple accounts that are managed by different people and have different controls and inconsistent policy. So simply consolidating those under a single IT sponsored format can make a huge difference for customers.
What about workload alignment? And by that, I mean taking a real deep look at your workload characteristics, your application characteristics, and devising metrics to measure the best fit deployment situation, whether it's on-prem physical or virtualized versus public cloud. Is that approach at all helpful? Is it different from some of these other techniques and approaches that you've already mentioned?
Workload alignment is hugely beneficial. Of course, we would recommend that they're doing that workload alignment before they move to the cloud so that they can make the decisions ahead of time before they realize they have a problem they need to fix. But if they haven't done it up front, go ahead, do it now. Look at your workloads, tear them apart, break them down, see where the usage is, see if there are things that they could be doing differently to help them figure out, again, is this application running 24/7, requiring a ton of resources? Maybe this is better for an on-premises type plan. Or is this something we're going to retire? Let's focus on getting a new environment set up in the cloud that's more appropriate, that can take better advantage of cloud resources and be more cost effective.
Yeah, one of the best ways to reduce cost in the cloud is not to move anything up there that doesn't belong there in the first place, and then have to move it back on premises, which means that you've got not only the cost of running that resource in the cloud, but you also have double the migration cost to stay exactly where you were if you find out 6 months down the road that maybe that wasn't the best decision. So, like I said, at the very least, while you're moving stuff to the cloud, you need to be evaluating what is the right way to do this, not just saying we're going to do a lift and shift and worry about the consequences later. At the very least, keep track of what you're doing and look for opportunities as a phase 2 or phase 3 to mature how you're leveraging the cloud resources.
Yeah, and I suppose if you're doing that work up front, you're saving yourself a double whammy.
Absolutely.
You've migrated it twice. John, sorry, I think I cut you off there.
We had one client who was all set to do a lift and shift into the cloud. They're very excited about it. They're going down the path. They were doing training, but they started to do a proper workload alignment and looking at their key resources, their key applications. They determined that if they did a straight lift and shift, it could be up to 4 times as expensive as their current payment plan. So they decided to stop that effort, roll back, and look at re-architecting, look at how to move forward properly. And again, that's a client that when they get fully rolling in the cloud, they're going to be very efficient and very cost effective.
Well, yeah, that money we're saving on avoiding the double whammy now gets put into something a lot more productive, like innovation and doing exactly the sort of application redesign that you're talking about. So we've talked about looking at the workloads, their services they're consuming, some of the process controls and techniques, right? Both at the tactical and the service level to control costs. Are there any other tangential areas, things that maybe they're so basic people don't think to do them that have impact on costs, things that aren't obvious on their face?
Governance is a big one with that. Again, a lot of people think about security with governance, which of course is very important. But when you think about the operational side of governance, again, how are we going to do change control? How are we going to authorize people to spin up resources in the cloud? Is it carte blanche for everybody, or is it perhaps limited either by role or by the amount of activities people can do? Again, building this stuff up front is not necessarily sexy, but it's what gets the job done and allows you to have that cost control.
Yeah, we like to focus early on operationalizing the cloud and enabling the cloud customer to understand how on-premises architecture and concepts translate to the cloud. It's not like you can take 1 or 2 classes, watch something online and presto, you're a cloud expert, right? But once you've got that muscle memory of doing things over time, you start to develop the capability to manage and mature how you're leveraging cloud, which drives more value out of it. So there are some simple things that you can do. You can create a cloud advisory board. I know that's the same acronym as a CAB. Think of something different. You can assign a cloud champion. There needs to be a process that you follow and someone responsible for making sure you follow that process.
What do you guys think about moving certain functions to public cloud, like backup and disaster recovery, as an example? What does the cost model look favorable for those types of services? Are there other benefits to maybe trying that first? Because I do see a lot of IT leaders asking us about that specifically.
DR is a great use case. Again, ideally, it's already well understood. It isn't day-to-day production, but it is built up to be that way. There should be existing run books, processes that allow people to move to a different environment. It's tested. So to take that existing DR type environment and say that's how we're going to dip our toe into the cloud, it's a great option. It allows you to test out all those features of the cloud. And at the end of the day, you can spin things up and then spin things down. So again, you're not paying money for the bulk of your resources once you're done with your DR activities.
Yeah, they're really, you've got three categories of cloud cost. You've got compute, storage, and network. And when you look at those, the most expensive cost for most customers is compute, which is the reason why I suggested GPU instances were one of the first things that I would look at. But if you look at network, egress charges, they're not terrible unless you're extracting wholesale tons and tons of data from the cloud. If you're doing backup and disaster recovery, you're mostly pushing to the cloud with periodic restores. If you have a wholesale failover and then fail back, and you need to ship a whole bunch of data back to on-premises, you may have a one-time hit. But
you're going to be right? At that point, you'd be happy to. That's not a overrun.
That's going to
look, I keep the business alive.
Yeah, absolutely. And storage costs are really the least of those. Storage costs are really a race to the bottom. It's a commodity utility resource. Storage is cheap. It's cheap in the cloud. It's pennies per gigabyte, and it's just going lower. So, you really don't have to think about the storage unless you're talking about petabytes.
So I realize as I look at the clock here, we're coming close to the end. I want to maybe ask you, any last thoughts about how we get started, or how you would guide someone to get started down the path to effective cost management?
So I would start with positioning an executive sponsor who's really going to be focused on received value from the cloud platform, and they're going to do that through a combination of cost management and net new capability. Because remember, the way to get the most out of any platform is to maximize the capabilities that you're driving out of it. If you can build a net new application and you can do it in half the time you did before, that's a value to you in the same way that reducing costs is. So having someone on the front end, sponsoring and tracking and driving that is going to make a big difference for organizations.
I think the key is to, again, have a sponsor and go slow to go fast. Take the time to do the analysis. Start back at the business requirements, figure out what your needs are, and then roll forward from there. Much better approach than to just dump everything into the cloud and then try to figure out what's right.
Yeah, when you do that, you're really incurring more technical debt that you have to work through later. It feels more of the same, like more of the old and busted kind of thing, but it's really busted when you move it that way. So just do it. Do the work on the front end. Do the work on the front end.
Awesome. Well, great admonishments for everybody, and I want to thank both of you, John and Scott, for taking time to talk through this with me. I know that you spend hours and days in workshops with IT leaders working through this discussion and talking through some of the issues with them and helping to solve that problem. And it's really hard to compress that experience into a short format like this. So I appreciate the time taken to help to try to do that. For those watching and listening, thanks very much for your time. And I hope we've given you some ideas to start controlling or to help manage your public cloud costs. Thanks for joining us. This has been Peter Kraatz, Scott Cameron, and John O'Shaughnessy from Insight's Cloud and Data Center Transformation Consulting Services team. Stay safe and have a great day.